So let's talk about how to do a team assessment. Now, there are a lot of good tools to help you out with this, including the Rate My League tool, which we recently did a lot of podcast episodes for looking at individual leagues, and thank you for everyone who signed up for that. It pretty much sold out the minute I made that video, so that was pretty awesome of you all, and I really appreciate it. But we don't always have a Rate My League tool or Rate My League pod, and we don't always trust online assessments because they're math, frankly, and hopefully we can be a little bit more nuanced than simple math calculation, which is why the pods I thought were a really good idea. But I basically have 5 criteria for assessing a team that I run through to try and get a good sense of where I'm at, what I need to do, and which direction I should really start pushing in general in a dynasty. So the first thing I really try and assess when I'm looking at a dynasty team is their draft capital. Now, dynasty leagues have a tendency to get overly invested or underinvested in draft capital depending on how they like to play dynasty in general. So don't take this as a draft capital is the single most important part of a team's build, but that is how I want to get my first initial impression of where the team is at, because depending on whether it has a lot or a little or a median amount of draft capital affects how I think of the other elements of what I think of the other elements of the team for various different reasons, as we'll see as we run through the list. Draft capital in general in Dynasty is the definition of liquid value or flexible value. It's more interesting to more teams and more standard, and it's more stable in how much other teams will value it at different points of the year. And so it's a good basis to plant our feet on to get a good sense of where this team needs to be at based on where its draft picks are at. The second part, doing a basic team assessment, is trying to understand the balance of the roster construction. This could also just be called roster construction in general. Who is on their team? What type of positions are on their team? And where is that team strong at those different positions? So if they have 3 running backs and they're all top 5 running backs, or do they have 50 wide receivers and none of them are rated in the top 24 in your mind or in your ranks or your personal preferences? And remember, we're mostly running this process over our own teams, so hopefully it should reflect that pretty strongly. But roster construction goes a little bit further than how many players do you have at each position and where is the strength of those positions. Where are the elite players? Are there any elite players at all? Is it fairly balanced over 2 positions or however it might be? It's also about where they have the hope and the potential upside in terms of both sources of value in a dynasty league. Points and tradability, or that flexible liquid value of how many other teams will value it in a trade should you need to make a trade. So, for example, I used to, and still often do, fall into the depth of despair that is rostering fairly deep wide receivers for their potential upside, and most of those players are points bets. They need to do something this season in order to maintain or increase in value in either sense. That's fine, but it's heavily based on how the roster construction is built. For example, if you're fairly solid at running back, if you have a good top 3 running backs, or even a good top 2 running backs, or a good top 1 running back, and a few decent running backs that you can stream, hopefully, as a running back too, that's where I might be more inclined to have more lower ranked wide receivers that I think have more upside than other people. Let me explain. If you want to roster Sky Moore, or if you're a more attractive, intelligent person and you prefer David Bell or Jalen Tolbert as those second-year disappointing wide receivers who might hit that 27% of wide receivers that actually elevate in value after having a disappointing rookie season for a lot less, then you need to be set at running back. And if you're rostering more depth at running back, you should be increasingly strong at wide receiver. Now, there's a balance here to be struck, and you have to assess it basically based on the individual team. But the stronger you are at running back, the more depth you can afford in terms of your bench at wide receiver, and vice versa. The other element, of course, is that you should always be rostering more running backs. This is literally my third criteria for a team, especially when I'm looking at my own. I look at the amount of running back depth, just players who might get opportunity to some certain different degrees, but definitely don't have any startability week 1, week 2, week 4, as far as we can see from this point in the season or any point in the season until they're actually on the field. And my general impetus is I want to cram as many running backs onto my bench at all points in the year, but especially at this point in the year, as possible. the Pierre Strongs, the Brian Robinsons, the who else have I got here? The Raheem Blackshears. Like, no names that might do literally nothing for their entire career in terms of fantasy, but I'm hoping to have different levels of opportunity based on context of how a season plays out, injuries, job opportunities, trades, transfers, whatever it might be. Running backs with some level of potential in their profile based on how productive they thought they were in college or on another team, or how much of the receiving game they typically acquire for themselves. There can be a lot of reasons to hunt a running back, but mostly whatever running back is most tempting on the waiver wire, based on any of those criteria, I'm trying mostly to add them to the back of my bench by bleeding specifically my wide receiver depth. Now, as I talked about with the second criteria, this has to be balanced with your overall roster construction. And while there are other elements to roster construction, especially based on league scoring and league situation, whether it's a keeper league or whether you have 5 bench spots, whether you have a tight end premium, all of those things can factor in. But you're trying to balance the amount of running back depth you have to a high degree. Why? Because running backs come from nowhere more often. They score more points in intermittent spurts because of a single game start, or increase in value for a very small window during a season or during the off season because of news from training camp, from the preseason, or from the injury report much more often than most other positions, and so they just have the highest for either types of value to turn up. The next thing I'll look at is what is the quality or type of players we're rostering as deep bench starts. Now again, if you play in a league where you have 5 to 7 bench spots, that changes everything. That means a wealth of wide receiver depth might be literally one spot on your depth chart because of the amount of running backs you're trying to roster in general in most situations, and so on and so forth. Tight end depth, it's a really good idea to play scattershot tight end, as Zach and I describe it on the Dynasty Grind, of just taking a few extra shots at the depth of tight end, because again, after running back, tight ends are the ones that come from nowhere the most often, and have those small windows of value based on startability and actual point scoring, and so tight end is the next priority in general. So having extra depth at tight end is great, but if you have 5 to 7 bench spots, a wealth of tight ends might be having one extra tight end. Outside of that, I want to assess if the roster cloggers on that roster, the ones that have no real expectation of increasing in value because they're not entering their second season following a positive rookie year. They're not going to the third season after 2 positive years. They're not rookies. They're not people they're not players in a particular position that we should expect to see large changes in their value or their point scoring. They're mostly roster cloggers. There's players that we have in year 3 and haven't done much in the league right now, or players entering year 2 that are those disappointing rookies, or running backs that have been in the league for a couple of years but have never yet accrued a start, or did for a certain period, like Myles Gaskin could be considered a roster clogger. But most of my roster cloggers, I want to be more Myles Gaskin or Michael Gallup or Adam Thielen or Brandon Cooks or Michael Thomas than I want them to be those players that have been disappointing without having yet had a stretch of value of some sort or other. In other words, roster cloggers in general, I want the majority of them to be has-beens, not could-be's. And again, based on the overall team construction and that initial assessment of draft capital, we could slide one way or the other on that. The fifth area, the general area that I'll look to assess a roster and where it's built and changes that I want to make to it overall, is that I want to overvalue rookies and I want to overvalue sophomores. When assessing a team, whether it's more competitive, less competitive, the other moves that it might need to try to make, whether it's mine or someone else's, I want to look at the young players that are in those windows of potential volume increases, potential value increases, and more likely point scoring opportunities more than they did the previous year. So players that have changed teams also fit into this category. And I want to overvalue those players. I want to make very few bets against the market. Like last year expecting CD Lamb to break out and then it working was a hard call to make because it was high value, but it was one of the very few calls I wanted to make strongly against ADP, and so I was very invested in doing that. I was also really invested in going in after Treylon Burks, which didn't work out as well, mostly hopefully because of injuries. But I want to make very few, but I want to make them very strongly on those rookies and sophomores. This is something I also talked about in my trade target videos, or the 4 areas I go looking for trades in, principally when I look at a generic dynasty roster or one of my generic teams. You want to overvalue things that are being undervalued because of a very small window of time. So we buy injured players in general if we get a discount. We also buy players based on how old or young they are who are falling in value for reasons that we know will end at a certain point. For example, rookies, if we have a strong feeling, a strong process, a strong inclination to believe they are good, they are being devalued technically right now because of their risk. But sophomores often enter into a more interesting category. This year, I'm really interested in a couple of second and even third year players that fit that bill. Because of missed time and missed injury, I think they might be undervalued for the market. And if I am right, this is a window of time where they're being devalued for previous performance, even though we know they're entering a period where they could score points and immediately change their value. So I want to overvalue those rookie and sophomore and even sometimes third year bets that I feel particularly strongly about.
Do you have the time to listen to me grind?
So here's one of my leagues. It's a best ball, superflex, large roster type league, but it's got standard scoring for the most part outside of that, and so it should be fairly easy for most of you to assess for yourselves. This is one of the teams I'm fairly proud of because I built it back through a significant loss after the rookie draft. And this is the first year I feel it's really competitive, entering its third or fourth season at this point. First criteria, the draft capital. I have neutral draft capital at this point. I have traded away my 24 pick, but I have 24 first round pick, but I have all my 25 picks. And it's fairly stable, but I don't have a wealth of draft capital overall. So, based on knowing that, I know this team needs to be more competitive, or it needs to be increasingly adding draft capital, because in general, most teams, at 70% of leagues outside the extreme zone either end, should mostly be working towards adding more value that is more exciting and more easily tradable to more teams in general. Looking at the roster, my roster constructor is heavily balanced between both the running back position and the wide receiver position. I have two starting quarterbacks in a superflex league in Trevor Lawrence and Dak Prescott, and some depth behind them with hopefully startability at some point in the future with Gardner Minshew and Bailey Zappi. It's a superflex, so you should always be investing in that depth. My running backs, however, are fairly strong, especially in a best ball league. I've got Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson, who I expect a lot from this season. So assessing the balance of the roster construction with that much wealth at running back, it's a team that is looking to compete, and that modifies what I think of its draft capital. I think a team that's heavily looking to compete this year is okay not having a wealth of extra picks. It would be nice if you had a competitive team and a wealth of picks. It means you can make any trade at any point to try and get more competitive in season. So I still know I would probably like to add draft capital, but as a team that's bleeding flexible value for actual concrete value in points per game, or my expectation of points per game for this season. Looking at the wide receiver position, I have three strong starters, in my opinion. Again, your opinion would change based on what you think of it. In Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, and Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman is showing some injuries right now, as he has done throughout his career at this point, but in my opinion, that's my top three wide receivers. I also have Michael Thomas, who could easily be that third wide receiver, scoring a lot more points than that in general. So despite having a lot of startability at the running back position, I still have very strong wide receiver starters. The tight end position, however, is at this point weakened. I had to make some trades to bleed my tight end one in order to get stronger running back and add some extra value at the other positions, and so tight end has become a weakness. But you can also see I have more tight ends than I would ordinarily roster because of that. Mike Gesicki, Brevin Jordan, Sam Laporta from this year's rookie draft, so I am trying to invest in youth in terms of value instead of draft picks. Also, Albert O didn't work out last year, and he's just a holdover on my roster. But it is a plethora of tight ends to try and make up for the fact that there's not a clear starter and certainly not clear upside at that position. And Sam Laporta is one attempt I've made to try and look for that upside based on my rookie evaluation of him. Also, you see that with Josh Weil, which is one of those depth tight ends I've added. So, in my opinion, I think this roster construction is good. I have very, very strong running backs. Breece Hall, hopefully, is going to get healthy sooner rather than later. Bijan Robinson should be a clear start. I also have a lot of other running backs around that. Despite the fact that it's a fairly competitive team, I have a few too many wide receivers, however. But that's because my top two wide receiver starters are fairly certain, but that third one is a little questionable. Is it Michael Thomas? Is it Rashad Bateman? this best ball team is going to be trying to stream that wide receiver 3 just based on my assessment of what I think is going to happen this season. And so I've rostered a little bit more wide receivers than I normally think is good, but it's because my running backs at the top are really strong, and so I feel like I can afford a little extra depth at wide receiver to try and make up for the weakness in that wide receiver 2 spot. As far as how much am I rostering the could-be's, I mostly have rookies in that category. I still am holding David Bell from last year, but at this point dropping him is literally just fine. But because of that 27%, he's a could-be that I don't feel strongly I have to drop, just like Jalen Tolbert. If you can find justification for rostering Sky Moore and other disappointing rookies at much higher value, I don't mind continuing to hold on those second-year misses, so long as I don't have to go and add drastic running back depth, because there's always a running back to roster in any league format. And because the wide receivers here are where I'm mostly searching for a streamability in the back end of the depth, I'm willing to waste more depth there. And then I think my extra depth of David Bell and Marvin Mims from this year's rookie draft, and A.T. Perry and Justin Ross, and even Kendrick Bourne, a little more justified because my running back position is a little stronger than I'm usually used to seeing it. Are my roster cloggers has-beens? No, but it is something I want to address. I do want more Adam Thielens, I do want more Michael Thomases, these has-beens on my roster. Have I overvalued rookies or sophomores or players in those crucial moments of their career where I think they might be moving into the next stage and I want to get ahead of that curve? I think so. I think rostering this many rookies in terms of Bijan Robinson and Devin Achane, also having Rashad Bateman on my team, these are players that I particularly highlight as in these moments where if enough of my assessment is correct, that this could be a value-changing year for them. They should see increases in value and increases in volume eventually, and so I want to exploit those markets. And I think this team is doing that while staying competitive, and it hasn't lost too much draft capital in that I still have all my 25 picks. It's just lost its 24 first. So as you can see, it's not a perfect process, but by looking at those 5 elements of a team, I immediately feel like I get a good idea of where this team is, so I can start making a plan for which direction it needs to go or what moves it needs to try to make more adamantly over the next 3 months, the next 2 weeks, or just in general moving forward. I'm not suggesting I always build the perfect dynasty squad and they always look like the most competitive teams, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of where I'm at and how I'm trying to move around using this basic assessment in really highly competitive teams. I think most teams exist in that 70%. They're not pure rebuild and they're not purely competitive team, and so we mostly should be making hardly any moves, but through a simple assessment of the roster, we can get a good idea of what are the moves we can try to make in general. Having a good on-running assessment of where the team's at and which moves it needs to prioritize, I think it's really key in Dynasty in general. But let me know what you think. Please mark my teams in the description, and that's what I'm trying to work on. But let me know what you think. Thanks for checking out the video, and I'll see you in the next one.